Well, we're in a transition from the fiat currency experiment that we started in 1971 to whatever comes after that when the fiat currency experiment blows up in our faces. So this is a fascinating time from the point of view of an economics nerd. You know, this is a stretch that they'll be writing history books about for the next century, but it's a terrifying thing to live through. So most people are going to hate the next few years if they don't already hate the current year, and the debate over what we build from the rubble of this system is going to be really contentious. So civil unrest is going to be just basically a staple of our world going forward, as it is right this minute, and war and financial crises. So very very tough times coming, but fascinating times with a lot of opportunities.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today's guest is John Rubino. John is a former Wall Street analyst, author, who also shares his thoughts on Substack. He's got over 20,000 followers on that. John, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Hey, Christian, it's good to meet you.
We'd love to start off, if you could unpack to the audience your 30,000 foot view of where we are, financial markets, global economy, perhaps geopolitics. Would love to start there.
Well, we're in a transition from the fiat currency experiment that we started in 1971 to whatever comes after that when the fiat currency experiment blows up in our faces. We're really close to the end of that process where the dollar and the euro and the yen start losing value in a uncontrollable way, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have to rebuild something from the rubble of this system. So this is a fascinating time from the point of view of an economics nerd. This is a stretch that they'll be writing history books about for the next century, but it's a terrifying thing to live through. So most people are going to hate the next few years if they don't already hate the current year, and the debate over what we build from the rubble of this system is going to be really contentious. So civil unrest is going to be just basically a staple of our world going forward, as it is right this minute, and war and financial crises. So very very tough times coming, but fascinating times with a lot of opportunities. And so on my Substack newsletter, basically, it's about looking for those opportunities and what kind of actionable advice makes sense for people, with all the stuff that's coming at us, and so it's a fascinating time, but a very scary time.
Now, as far as the geopolitical front goes, what's your current take, if you care to comment on that, whether that's Ukraine, Iran, potential with China? How are you seeing things shake out as it relates to the financial markets, et cetera?
Well, geopolitics is even crazier than usual. We're usually on the verge of a war. If you go all the way back to our childhoods, there's very seldom been a time when we weren't right there, right? Sending troops to some border or shooting at someone else's planes or something. There was always something going on that could lead to something much more serious. We're there again, of course, but in a much scarier way, because first of all, we blundered into a proxy war in Ukraine with a nuclear power, and none of that was necessary. It was just a handful of crazy people running the U.S. government who wanted to take Russia off the chessboard and are basically risking nuclear war in order for that to happen. And then the Middle East, of course, is always on the verge of something. And one of the big terrifying things that we've been on the verge of for a long time, but that hadn't happened, just happened. Israel just started bombing Iran. Iran fired missiles back at Israel and basically overwhelmed Israel's missile defense system. So Tel Aviv is being bombed like London during the Blitz in World War II. Terrifying times. Here's an interesting, just a sidelight, okay? Because I just posted a thing this morning about how the fact that Iran's missiles are overwhelming Israel's missile defense system is a really good sign for silver, because missiles have silver in them. And when a missile blows up, that silver is basically just vaporized. It goes away. It's taken off the market. And now that everybody sees around the world that missiles are able to overwhelm missile defense systems, everybody who doesn't have a ton of missiles, every government's military now is going to demand way more missiles, which means, because there's silver in virtually every missile that's used now, that means a big increase in demand for silver. And so I made the mistake of using a Middle Eastern war as a lead into an investment thesis. And so I've been getting a lot of blowback from that today, like, people on either side claiming I don't care enough about their side. And it's horrible what's happening. And I care about both sides, and I want everybody to be okay, and I want the fighting to stop. But in the meantime, silver just got another boost on the global markets, and its price is probably going to go up from here. So that's what I mean by actionable advice drawn from the chaos of today's world. There's a lot of that out there. Things you can do to protect yourself, protect your family, and give yourself a better chance of not just surviving but thriving in a world that is getting more and more chaotic.
I speaking of, obviously, you mentioned about silver's application, as well as I think of other people who've unpacked, various resources that various nations are trying to extract, or banks trying to add to their balance sheet. I found it interesting to listen to. I think it was Alex Crane or some of these others kind of dive into unpack that. Whether that's Wall Street / Bank of England. I've heard people talk about. I think it was E.B. Tucker. I think that was his name. Another individual alluding to that. What's your, if you care to dive down that rabbit hole, so to speak, what's your kind of take on who's kind of running things behind the scenes, and kind of the overall thesis, and then obviously how it all ties in?
Okay, it might be good to start with the whole fiat currency thing and what is money and everything, because that basically determines how we got this aristocracy that is now in charge of the world. Back in 1971, the world was mostly kind of on a gold standard, which tied the hands of governments monetarily by limiting the amount of new money that they could create. Governments hated that. So in 1971, the US took us off the more or less global gold standard that we were on. And everybody from that point forward got basically a monetary printing press, which is an unlimited credit card from the point of view of a government. And so what governments do now is they create huge amounts of new currency out of thin air. They hand it to their bankers, and then the bankers give it to their favored customers. So those people get to use the currency that's newly created before inflation lowers the value of the currency. So the rich get richer. Stocks and bonds go up in value, and the guys who already own the stocks and bonds get richer and richer. And they eventually take over the system. And that's where we are now. We have just a very small handful of people running the big banks, the military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical companies, a lot of other big corporations. And they're in charge of the government in the US and governments around the world. And so they've set up a system that whenever there's a crisis, the policy response is designed to make the rich even richer. And that's where we are right now. We've got a 1% or maybe a 10% who just love the system. They think the world is run right, and a 90% of the population who just hate the way the system is designed to always siphon wealth away from them and give it to somebody else. And that's why there are populist revolutions happening all around the world. That's why Donald Trump is president. Because a populist comes in and says, look, you're being screwed over by a handful of rich people. Put me in power and I will take back what's been stolen from you. And that can be left-wing populism or right-wing populism. But Bernie Sanders would be a left-wing populist. Donald Trump would be a right-wing populist. But it's always very popular in times like this. You get elected with that kind of a platform, but nobody really knows ahead of time what kind of policies are going to flow from that. So it tends to be kind of chaotic. So we're in one of those times. And yeah, we've got call it the deep state, call it the aristocracy or an oligarchy or whatever you want, but it's a handful of people who are super rich and who control everything. And they are going to war against the populists. So we're seeing a lot of governments go very authoritarian, especially in Europe, and then the US prior to the last election, where anybody who dissents from government policy is labeled a terrorist of some sort and censored or imprisoned. And so this is a really dangerous time, besides being a really complicated time, because even what I'm saying right now would have been kicked off YouTube under the Biden administration and Twitter before Elon Musk bought it. So, you couldn't have a discussion about the pandemic or about war or about monetary policy or anything, because the governments feel threatened by any kind of dissent. And that's where we are now around the world. So if you're in Germany or Great Britain, you have to be very careful that you can be thrown in prison for an opinion. And that's because the governments are terrified of losing the next election and just being swept out of power completely. So, don't be surprised if all of this resolves with some civil wars, some flat out fighting in the streets, one group against the government or whatever, in a lot of major countries, because we're definitely headed that way. And I think we'd be very lucky to completely avoid it. It's possible that some kind of a monetary reset happens where governments just decide on some Sunday night that we're going to do away with the currency is whatever the government says it is and raging inflation kind of thing, and go back to maybe a gold standard or some other monetary system that's designed to forbid governments from just creating currency out of thin air. But I don't think we get there until that is the least bad option on a list of really bad options. But again, that's coming. There's no way to avoid it with all the money we've borrowed so far. And again, the intellectual challenge is, how do you set yourself up so you can survive and thrive in what's coming?
What are some potential things that you see coming down the pipeline?
Well, let's look at the monetary part of it. We borrowed insane amounts of money. Every government has, and they've also encouraged their citizens to borrow crazy amounts of money too. So every major country, with just a couple of exceptions like Russia and Switzerland, are wildly over indebted. And the only way for governments to prevent all of that debt from blowing up the economy and giving us a 1930s style deflationary depression is to create more currency out of thin air and flood the system with it. In other words, to try to inflate away the debt that they've taken on. And that inevitably makes the value of the currency go down. In other words, you get inflation. So we had double-digit inflation in 2022 already. So everybody knows that's possible now. And the deficits, for instance, what the US is running, we're borrowing $2 trillion new dollars every year just to keep the government afloat. And the interest on that debt is now above $1 trillion a year and heading higher. So we have to borrow the interest that we pay on our debt, which raises the deficit in the following year, makes the interest we have to borrow to pay even higher, and so on. And there's no fix for that. That's the kind of thing that a term for it is financial death spiral. When you're borrowing to cover the interest on your debt, you're basically headed for bankruptcy. And so what that means for the US and for most of the rest of the world is that the currency stops or starts falling dramatically. Prices of things go way up. The cost of living goes up for most people, and life becomes incredibly hard. You get civil unrest because of that, and the politicians who are in charge get voted out of office and replaced with people who may or may not have an idea of what they're doing. Until things just spin out of control. Mass bankruptcies, currency devaluations in a really dramatic way. And then the end result there is either global war or some kind of a currency reset where we kind of sit down and cobble together a new monetary system that is designed to fix the problems that got us into the last mess. And that's going to be a fascinating debate. And I wouldn't presume to predict exactly how it turns out, but hopefully we go back to what we had for the 200 years before 1971, some version of a commodity-based standard, probably a gold standard, where the fact that a country is on a gold standard limits the amount of debt it can take on and the amount of money it can create. And so life gets harder for governments, but it gets easier for everybody else. So we'll see. It's what we're headed for. It's going to be a fascinating time, but it's also going to be a very scary time.
Now, you mentioned war earlier, and not to put that out in the universe, so to speak, but I have to ask, what is the likelihood of there being some type of kinetic conflict that is global, in your
Oh,
opinion?
we're blundering into a bunch of those. There are guys in charge of the U.S. called neocons, for neoconservatives, who believe that we in the US, with 5% of the world's population, ought to rule the other 95% for the next 1,000 years. And they have a lot of wars lined up that they want us to fight in order to take all the possible competition off the chessboard. And so we've already fought a bunch of them. Libya is no longer any kind of a threat, and Syria, Iraq, and Iran is the next on the list, and that just started. So yeah, and it's very possible that any of these things can spin out of control if they suck Russia in, or China, or somebody else that has nuclear weapons. If you're just beating up on some little relatively undeveloped country and you're a big empire like the U.S., it's messy and it's unpopular, but it's not existentially threatening. But trying to do that to Russia or China could cost us human civilization. We have enough nuclear weapons between the three of us, Russia, China, and the U.S., to pretty much end human civilization as we know it right now. And we seem to be actively picking fights with those guys. Like we just don't think that there's any circumstance where they would use nuclear weapons. And I don't think we can bet our lives or bet our civilization on that, because when you back somebody into a corner, they're going to lash out. And when a nuclear power lashes out, there are all kinds of ways for that to go very badly. And yeah, for some reason, the guys in charge of the U.S. don't seem to understand that their kids will be vaporized too. They seem to be, in their own minds, invulnerable. Like they're going to be in their bunkers and they're going to survive. And then they're going to come back out and find that, okay, most people are dead, but there's enough dead alive in the U.S. to go out and rule the rest of the world. That doesn't sound like a good scenario, especially because I have two kids. I don't want to see them incinerated in a nuclear holocaust. But the U.S. is acting as if that's a winnable scenario. That, okay, we start this fight, but we win it. We kill more millions of them than they kill millions of us. And in the end, we're in charge of the rubble. And that's a horrifying thought. But it seems to be what a lot of the guys in charge believe and what they're pursuing right now. So here's hoping that doesn't work out. It was encouraging for a while with Trump, because he got elected specifically to end the forever wars. And if he kept his word, then we wouldn't be fighting all these wars right now. We'd be negotiating our way out of them. But I guess not. We'll see.
And as it relates to Trump and his administration, how much of what he is hoping to achieve and what he's campaigned upon, he is going to be able to implement or effectuate?
Well, his first 60 days were chaotic, but they were interesting. He shut down the border, which, nobody thought it could be done in weeks, but he just did it. The border is a ghost town right now. So that was very good. He, with the tariffs and things, a tariff-based policy is very chaotic, but it's a behavior change mechanism. And it's leading a lot of countries and a lot of big companies around the world to set up factories in the U.S., which was a big goal of the populist movement here. And that's happening, and that's great. The more factories that come back to the U.S., the better the chance for Trump's base. In other words, middle class or high school educated people who work with their hands, better the chance they have of getting back to being able to have a middle class life, and which is the way it used to be for a long time in the U.S. And that's really good. But now we've kind of veered off into, all right, Russia didn't settle Ukraine right away, so maybe we're going to go back to helping Ukraine, and Israel really wants us to bomb Iran, so maybe we'll just go ahead and do that, and that's not at all what people who voted for Trump thought they were getting. So actually, there's a lot of headlines right now about civil war within the MAGA camp, because a lot of people who are big Trump fans, like Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson and many, many more, are not happy with what's going on lately. So this adds an element of chaos to an already chaotic situation, because we could have presumably negotiated some deals with Russia and Iran that would have at least bought time before the next flare-up. And that doesn't seem to be happening now. It seems like we're just going to do it kinetically. We're going to win these wars, and the risk of miscalculating and something like that is just horrifying. So, to sum up, I like a lot of what Trump has done, and I don't like a lot of what he's doing right now. So, with any luck, we settle the wars in the next few months, and then the whole immigration things get sorted out in a way that that doesn't leave us being overwhelmed by 10 million military-age men who are completely unvetted and we don't know where they are. We can't have that happening. So we do away with that kind of a border policy, and we get something in its place that's manageable. We get a lot of new factories coming in, so wages start to go up. And if we've cut deals that keep us from being at war, that's a pretty good 2 years, because then comes the midterm elections when the Republicans have to try to hold on to the House. And that's not normally how it works. Normally in midterm elections, the party in power loses a lot of seats and sometimes loses control of the House altogether. And in that case, you get a paralyzed government. So the second 2 years of the Trump administration will be a lot less eventful than the first 2 years. So they know they need to get a lot done in 2 years. And that's part of the reason for the chaos, because they need to get it done soon. And I get that. But there is, despite all the chaos, a chance that we end up with peace, rising wages, and an under control border by the time of the midterm elections, and the Republicans have a pretty good record to run on. But thank God for that. I think they feel like, thank God that the election isn't today, because it would be hard to defend this chaos in an election environment.
Now, I've heard some people talk about that because of where we as a West are as it relates to debt levels, things of that nature, that the only way to kind of regalvanize everyone's support behind the government per se is to get involved in these overseas conflicts. I mean, how much of that I guess statement do you agree with, or do you have a difference of opinion with some pundits having speculated on that? I mean, what are your thoughts on that, John?
Well, I think when a government mismanages a country, one of the strategies for dealing with the blowback from that is to start a war somewhere else. Find somebody, designate them as the next Hitler, and make them an existential threat, and in that way distract people domestically from your mismanagement and scare them enough that they're willing to keep you in power to deal with the crisis. And so that could explain a lot of what's going on in the world right there. Europe, for instance, has horrendously mismanaged pretty much every country that makes it up right now. And so you see the European governments suddenly getting all warlike. They're talking about increasing their military spending from 2% of GDP up to 5% of GDP, and to going right at Russia because Putin is the next Hitler, and don't kick us out of office because you need us to fight this coming existential war. It's a scam. I think most adults see it as a scam, but there's a lot of people who are either uninformed or just new to the political process who can be fooled by something like that. And maybe that's enough to keep the parties in power who are in power now in Europe, and it might work for them. And I don't think the US is doing that, because a lot of the craziness in the Trump administration happened right away. I mean, just in the first few months, we've only had Trump in power for a little while. So I don't think they've come to the conclusion that they've mismanaged the country to the point where they need to start a war to distract us. I think there's other stuff going on. And add it all up, and it makes the world a much harder to manage place. And we haven't even really talked about Asia yet, because Japan, their government on a per capita basis has more debt than any other country in human history. They've got a massive currency crisis coming their way. China engineered the biggest real estate bubble in human history, and now that is bursting, and they're not really sure what to do, because they aren't really familiar with actual markets over there. So they're just trying to decree a solution, and that's not likely to work. So, big parts of Asia. Oh, and then demographics are a crisis for those guys. Both of them have shrinking populations, which means there are fewer and fewer workers to, with their tax money, support a growing group of retirees. And that's a recipe for financial disaster. So wherever you look, weird stuff is happening, most of it being traced from the fact that we went off the gold standard way back when, and most of it unfixable in the current system. So, yeah, I think, we could spend a whole show just on Japan, for instance. Its situation is so fascinating and so scary, and potentially so consequential, because it's, what is it now, the third biggest country in the world, highest GDP. So trouble there is trouble everywhere. And so that leads to a lot of talk about the catalyst for the next crisis, because there are so many big things that can go wrong, so many gray swans, things that we know could happen, but we don't expect to happen. And that's just a question of which one happens and sets off the next financial crisis. And I don't know what it would be. I think war is probably the biggest, most likely one, but spiking inflation and currency crises in other countries, and lots of other things that are out there are all kind of on the list of stuff that could blow up on us. Well, then there's AI. What if somebody who we don't really trust gets the first self-aware AI that's able to improve itself and break any encryption and steal any data, with the CIA has it, or China has it, or any number of other people that don't seem trustworthy. There's your black swan. That's going to be something that might happen in the next 3 years, the way the trend is going for AI, and might play out in a very unpredictable way. So, what a world. Which kind of leads back to the gold and silver thesis, because you need real money in a situation like this. And for 3,000 years, gold and silver have held their value through pretty much every kind of crisis that humanity and nature could dream up. And that's why gold is going up the way it is now. Everybody's looking for some kind of a store of value that is protection from all this crazy stuff. And gold is leading that race. It's attracting the most capital. A lot is flowing into Bitcoin as well, which is really interesting wild card in this kind of an environment. But the fact that most of the world's central banks are now aggressively buying gold means that's the leading candidate for the bedrock of the next financial system. And it means that emulating those central banks is a pretty good strategy for individuals. We should be stackers. We should be buying physical gold and silver, because those things are immune to most of what the world is going to throw at us in the next few years.
I know China, or at least from what I've heard, China has been encouraging their citizens to acquire gold and things of that nature. And speaking of China and Asia, do you see China being potentially the next New York, if you will, or London, as being really the epicenter in the world for financial markets, things of that nature, or where do you see it?
Well, for a while it looked like that because China is just so big, and it was developing so quickly. It was building entire new modern cities that make New York City look like something from the 1940s. Um, but then one, the demographic crisis hit, and their population is actually shrinking. And the number of new workers coming into the workforce is way smaller than the number of people leaving the workforce through retirement. That's really a destabilizing kind of trend. And you don't rule the world with that kind of demographics. And then you got the finances because they basically quintupled their debt in order to get out of the Great Recession 15 years ago. And a lot of that flowed into real estate. So, like I talked about before, they've got this giant real estate bust that's coming their way. And that's going to be very distracting. And add to that the fact that the US is stomping around the world, bullying everybody in sight with the dollar and the international banking system, which they control and everything. And so China's got a very stressful geopolitical situation and a very stressful internal situation. And so it's not the profile of the world's most powerful country anymore. So no, I don't think China becomes a replacement for the U.S. I think that they have problems of their own, and they're going to be kind of hard pressed just to get through the next 20 years in one piece. So, the question is, what will the U.S. look like that? And that is a more complex question. I think we are in way better shape than virtually anybody else in the world, but we still have some hard times to go through. And we don't know how we're going to deal with those hard times. So it's very hard to predict the future world 10 years out, just because so many of these crises are inherently unpredictable. You got guys sitting around a conference table with imperfect information, and they're under massive stress, and they have to decide whether to go to war or whether to shut down a big part of their banking system or whatever, the things they're going to have to think of going forward. And it's unreasonable to expect them to come up with good ideas and implement them flawlessly. It's going to be a mess. And so I think, the world is going to do what it's going to do. And you and I and your listeners, in a lot of ways, we're kind of on our own. We have to figure out what works for us and then hope we don't get vaporized in a nuclear war, and because we can't control that. But we can control what we do with our finances, what we do with our communities, and whether we grow some of our own food, how we become more and more connected to the people around us. Those are all things we should be doing, which are basically just common sense. What is considered prepping now, and maybe even survivalism. Those are just things that smart people used to do back in the day. Most people had gardens. Most people had guns. Most people knew other people in their community. And because of that, they had people who could watch their backs in hard times. We drifted away from that because life got too easy. But now we kind of have to go back in that direction and start living the way our grandparents lived in order to protect ourselves and our families.
Well, that's what I think is so interesting, John, is how pre 20th century, Americans, and I'm sure more, many other parts of the West, so much of one's sustenance was predicated on like agriculture or, you're more self-sufficient. And then like pre-industrial age, like everyone is working in a warehouse and this corporate, structure that came about in the 19th century, I guess, really. It's interesting how everyone was kind of able to provide for themselves. They were artisans, craftsmen, and such. And then I think now we're going to have to, and especially the digital economy and such, how that's changed so much. I think we're going to see kind of a breakdown from corporate life, so to speak, to more of this. Everyone is able to provide for themselves in more of a capacity than we see today.
Yeah. Well, nobody can do everything. But if you look at people in the 1940s and 50s, and before, of course, and supply chains were largely local, and people knew how to do stuff. They could fix a car or a garden tool or something like that. They knew how to handle the physical world around them in a way that most of us today just can't hope to do. And that's a more resilient lifestyle. Things can go just crazy all around you, but if you're making 50% of your food in the garden, and you're able to fix your car even if the local mechanic goes out of business, you can basically get by. And if you've got a family and friends around you who can pick up the slack when you need that, then these crazy times just kind of pass over us without really affecting our lives that much. And not only is that a healthier way to live most times, but in times of crisis, it's existentially important. It's basically how you survive. So yeah. And the thing is, a lot of this stuff is really rewarding. I mean, if you grow some food, that most people who do it find that they gain a lot of happiness from it. And fixing something that's broken instead of going out and buying a new one, that's really satisfying. A lot of people who can do stuff like that don't do it because they have to. They do it because it's fun to do, and you get a real sense of accomplishment from maintaining a thing that you've had for 20 years already and that you think you'll be able to have for another 20 years. So that's a lifestyle to aspire to. And we're really far away from it, most of us, but small steps. We can all move in that direction by learning some things we don't already know, and it's a good life.
Now, as it relates to how advice that you'd like to share with the audience on how to hedge or kind of take a more defensive position. Obviously, gold, silver, metals is one avenue. Could you share what your suggestion would be to people who have maybe your standard typical portfolio set up with a financial advisor and such, what your advice might be to, hey, I would allocate X much to this of your portfolio, X much to that. I mean, could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah. First, kind of a macro thing. When you hear all this gloom and doom, like a lot of what I've said here today, it's easy to focus on that, get depressed, and then not really take any steps to help yourself. But it's helpful psychologically if you see all this stuff going on and then you interpret it as an investment thesis. In other words, okay, this happened a few decades ago, and this happened a few centuries ago, and what happened? How did money work during that time? Who got rich from these things that are recurring now? These human mistakes that get made over and over again, looking at it as a way to make lots of money and protect yourself and your family is a lot more psychologically helpful than just going, oh my God, the world is ending. So think of this as an investment thesis. Crazy stuff is coming. What do we do to make a lot of money? And as you said, somebody with a standard 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, they might have a problem because they've done beautifully with that portfolio over the last really 50 years. But what used to be very safe is no longer safe in the world that's coming. For instance, bonds are basically loans that you make to somebody like the government, and they pay you interest, and then at the end of the term, they give you back your capital. Well, that means a bond depends on the value of the currency for its value. So if we're going into a period when currencies are going to become unstable and fall in a unmanageable way, then your bonds are going to lose a lot of value. So the 40% of your portfolio that's in quote unquote safe stuff is no longer safe. And equities get extremely volatile. So your 60% in stocks could end up behaving in really crazy ways, which maybe that's fine if you're 35 years old and you've got another 4 decades before you really have to have that money. But if you're, going on 70, like a lot of boomers are, and you've got 60% of your portfolio in stocks, you can't really get through a down decade. And it's very possible that down decades are coming. So your stocks are also not reliable anymore. So that makes a lot of people who've done very well with their financial planning in the past, it puts them in really shaky positions going forward. So I would say that the way you deal with that is to de-emphasize financial assets like bonds and some stocks. I'd look at real stuff, physical gold and silver that you control, that nobody else has to keep a promise. There's no counterparty risk. Um, that has tended to do really well in times of extreme chaos. Um, and then the stocks, to the extent that you have stocks, have them be in commodities. In other words, ExxonMobil because they own oil wells, or Newmont because it owns gold mines. And they will tend to do really well in the same kind of environment where physical gold and silver protect you. So shift from financial assets into real assets, and then also land. Of course, if you can buy some farmland, that's a good thing to do right now. And to the extent that you're mostly in real stuff, you'll get through this in pretty good shape, probably, and or at least much better shape than you would have if you stayed in the 60-40 stocks to bonds, and a lot of your stocks were, bank stocks and other kinds of financially related equities, where you could lose 60% of your nest egg easily in the kind of environment that's coming, and you don't want that. You want it to stay stable and maybe grow in the worst case scenario, and to do really, really well in the best case scenario. And physical assets are probably the kind of thing that'll do that going forward.
And as it relates to equities and such in securities, I'm reminded of David Rogers Webb's book, The Great Taking. And I had Bill Holter on earlier, I think it was last week, and he mentioned about having, I guess, a custody of the stock, so to speak, like the certificate, as a means to kind of circumvent that uh, securities revision thing that they made. I don't know if you care to share your thoughts on that, or et cetera.
Yeah, the great taking is a very scary scenario. And basically, what the author of that book says is that we've changed the rules of American, at least, financial life, so that we don't actually own our stocks and bonds. The things in a brokerage account are not necessarily ours. And if that broker or our bank gets into some kind of financial trouble, the government can step in, empty our account, and give it to the bank or broker to keep them afloat. So we can basically have our financial assets confiscated. And now I don't know how to judge um, that theory, but a lot of smart people take it very seriously, and they think that's a real possibility. So yeah, getting your stocks, instead of being in the brokerage house's name and held in an account that you can't get to if the internet goes down, for instance, you can get them sent to you. You can get those stocks put into your name, sent to you in paper form, and then you get to hold on to them. Now, there are risks associated with that because your house could burn down or somebody could break in and steal them. Um, and so it's not a risk-free strategy, and it's not simple, and it doesn't allow you to buy and sell very easily. You can't, like if you see a crash coming and you've got a bunch of paper stock certificates in your house, you can't bail. You're stuck with those stocks. So it's the kind of thing that, yes, it protects you from one kind of risk, but it brings some other risks with it, and we all have to make our own personal decisions about how to balance those risks. It could be that getting some stocks in your name and then storing them in a very safe place is a good diversification. In other words, it spreads your risks around a little bit and increases the odds that some of what you own will survive whatever's coming. So yeah, I can see taking that thesis seriously in that case, but I don't know how to judge it myself. And for that reason, I tend to own more physical stuff that I do understand. But I could understand somebody wanting to get physical stock certificates, and maybe it's a good idea.
And then, what are some things that you feel don't receive enough attention, perhaps keep you up at night, or that are even misconceptions as it relates to the global economy, geopolitics, things that might come as a surprise to people?
Well, I think one of the things that people misunderstand is that if we just elect good people, then things will run right and we'll be okay. And it's all about, putting the right people with the right philosophies into place. And we are way past that. There's nothing anybody can do to avoid a crisis because the numbers don't work anymore. So it would definitely be ideal to have good people in charge, but they can't fix what's coming. So the idea that the next election is what we should focus on because that might be how we fix everything is false. We can't fix what's coming. And let's see, what else? The idea that because a few things that might happen are unlikely means we can dispense with them, like the AI thing. That's highly unpredictable, but it's conceivable that AI takes some kind of a quantum leap and that changes everything. And just because it's not likely to happen in the near term doesn't mean we shouldn't include that in our planning. And then there's all kinds of black swans out there that have very low probabilities, but if you add them all together, you get a reasonable probability of one of them happening. And one thing is an EMP attack. That's where somebody sets off a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere and that fries all of the electronics in a country. That's completely possible in today's world. A solar flare, the sun kind of doing the same thing as an EMP attack. That actually happens once in a while. Every once in a while, the sun will shoot out a stream of radiation, and it's strong enough that if it hit us, it would basically fry most of Earth's electronics and send us back to the 1850s in some technological ways. And things like that, if you look at the history of it, they've happened in the recent past, but they missed us. The sun did that thing, but it shot it in the wrong direction. But had it shot it in our direction, we would have had very serious problems. So, caution is a really good attitude now, and acknowledging that even these black swans are possible too. I think if that's the thing that motivates us to take care and not take big chances with things that can just evaporate, and where there are counterparty risks, where other people have to keep some kind of a promise in order for our bet to work out. And we just avoid that as much as possible, we'll be in good shape. So yeah, wild times coming, but there are lots of opportunities buried in the risks.
Well, John, I appreciate you carving out the time to be on the show today. How can people learn more about you and get in touch?
I'm at rubino.substack.com, and I have a newsletter there that, like I said, it looks for actionable advice for preparing for all of this stuff. And so far, so good. It's got gold portfolios and uranium miner portfolios that have done really well lately. So I can't speak to the long term or to the immediate. Well, anyhow, we're doing okay in the portfolios there, and subscribers can check that out.
John, appreciate you coming on and hope to have you on later this year.
Thanks, Christian. Look forward to it.
Quick ask, over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.